This week's Parsha, while it's not the last Parsha in the Torah, it does serve as an interesting bookend of sorts when it comes to the mitzvos. You see, it's interesting to compare what the first and what the last mitzvah are in the entire Torah. And as we all know, often it's that first or maybe the last thing that a person says, whether it's a speech or a class, that we actually remember. And so when we look back at the very beginning of Breshit, we see very clearly that the first commandment is the mitzvah of pru'ervu, of multiplying and having children. And what's interesting is that in our Parsha this week, the very last mitzvah, number 613, the last mitzvah in the entire Torah, is found in our Parsha. And our Parsha writes, Ve'ata kitvu lachem et hashira hazot, write this song, ve'lamdu et bnei Yisrael, and go and teach it to the other people of Israel, and sima b'fiyam, and put it into their mouths. And while some of the commentaries suggest that this final mitzvah relates to the song that we're going to find in next week's Torah portion of Ha'azinu, the Rambam and others codify this verse, they codify this pasuk to teach us about the obligation to write a Sefer Torah. That every single Jew has an obligation to fulfill this mitzvah by writing their very own, or nowadays participating in writing a communal Sefer Torah. But the question that I want to explore is actually, I think, very simple. What is it that is so unique about these two mitzvos, the mitzvah of pru'ervu and of writing a Sefer Torah, that warrants them receiving such special placement as the first and as the last mitzvah in the entire Torah? And so perhaps we can suggest that these two mitzvos in fact share a common theme, and that they focus on the perpetuation of the Jewish people. Pru'ervu facilitates the physical perpetuation of the Jewish people by bringing more Jewish children into the world. And by doing so, we ensure that there are more Jewish people who are going to continue to populate the earth. And conversely, when it comes to writing a Sefer Torah, it also bolsters the spiritual perpetuation of the Jewish people by, quote-unquote, giving birth to more Sifrei Torah. And by doing so, we ensure the intact transmission of our tradition from generation to generation. And by doing so, we preserve the soul of the Jewish people that has sustained us throughout our history. And so by bookending the remaining 611 mitzvos with these two, in many ways, related mitzvos, the Torah hints to us that all of its mitzvos are not simply to be performed by individuals during their lifetimes, but they're meant to be passed on to future generations. And indeed, it is the physical and it is the spiritual continuity of our people that are equally essential. And in fact, the Gemara in Sanhedrin highlights this connection between both the spiritual and the physical of quote-unquote procreation by teaching us that a person who teaches his friend's child Torah is considered to having actually given birth to them. In other words, passing on Torah to the next generation, it's no less an act of procreation than physically bringing children into this world. And we see a similar idea in the Shulchan Aruch, which teaches us that it's interesting that just as children have parents, halacha dictates that every single Sefer Torah, every Torah scroll, it needs to be copied letter for letter from actually a parent Sefer Torah, with not even a single letter written from memory. And if we said it differently, these two pillars are at the core of how we perpetuate the Jewish people, both physically and spiritually, into the future. In other words, whereas other mitzvos are all about the here and the now. Think about eating matzah on Pesach or blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. But when it comes to pru'ervu, when it comes to writing a Sefer Torah, the focus is on the benefit of future generations that do not yet exist. And the Torah, by starting and by ending with these two mitzvos, helps remind us that we are simply part of a larger tradition. Our moment in time, it's not a moment of isolation. Rather, we, like the generations who come before us, are obligated to continue to pass on our values and to build our Jewish future. And I think that this is an incredibly important message for all of us right now on this last week of the Jewish year 5780. It's during this time that we focus a lot and think a lot about what we want and what we hope and what we pray for in our futures, both personally and for the Jewish community. And there is no doubt that when it comes to our physical continuity, our physical health, that this year we have understandably, that we've put an enormous focus and we've put so much energy into thinking and praying for it. And yet this time of year also begs us to think long and hard about our spiritual future as well. What do we hope? What do we yearn? What do we pray for when it comes to our spiritual future? What do we hope to leave for our children, for our grandchildren, and for their children to come? What should be our goals for our own personal, more finite future in our coming year? And what's fascinating is that when it comes to this final mitzvah of creating this spiritual future, of writing a Torah scroll, the Torah actually uses unique language. You see, instead of explicitly telling us, Kitvu lachem et ha-Torah, write for yourself a Torah, our Parshat teaches, Kitvu lachem et ha-Shirah, write the song. And perhaps we can suggest that the key to unlocking our potential is in this comparison of the Torah being a shira, of being a song. As Rabbi Jonathan Sachs writes, that the 613th command, it's not simply about writing down the Torah, but rather it's about the duty to make the Torah new in each generation, to make the Torah live again and fresh, to make it relevant, to make it engaging on a spiritual level. Words, he writes, are the language of the mind, but music, shirah, is the language of the soul. And each and every one of us, we each sing differently. There's something different for each of us that we find the joy, that we see the beauty in Judaism within. In that sense, the Torah needs to be something that resonates with all of us personally, but also with each and every unique generation. And when the Torah becomes a song, Rabbi Sachs writes, it stays with us. And when we can remember that and help people make those connections, then we can fulfill this mission of the first and the last mitzvah of the Torah, which is perpetuating our tradition. And so as we wrap up this year, let us set this as a goal for ourselves, but also for our community. Let's work hard in the weeks to come to improve our spiritual future and to do it by finding our unique voice and our own personal connection to the Torah. And by doing that, we can ensure not only a wonderful year filled with blessings of good health and happiness, but a strong Jewish future for ourselves, for our family, and for our entire community. And so Orit and Shaya and Nava and Noam, they join me in wishing you and your family a Shabbat Shalom, a peaceful and a restful and a wonderful Shabbat.